carry me back to old Virginia. Carry me back to old Virginia.
Thank you for tuning into this special episode of the Virginia History Podcast, in which I teamed up with Commemoration 2019 once again, this time to interview the Library of Virginia's Dr. Sandra Gioia Treadway. Dr. Treadway earned her Ph.D. in history from the University of Virginia and taught at Virginia Tech for 2 years while she moved into an editorial position at the then-named Virginia State Library in Richmond, Virginia. She fell in love with the library's collection and decided to remain at the library. Dr. Treadway's astounding work includes many essays, articles, and publications that have greatly aided Virginia's continuing historical research. Notable works include Virginia Women, Their Lives and Times, Volumes 1 and 2, in which she was both an editor and contributor, Dictionary of Virginia Biography as editor, and Women of Mark, A History of the Women's Club of Richmond, Virginia, 1894 to 1994. She serves and has served on many boards of directors throughout Virginia and is a sought-after speaker, especially concerning the topic of Virginia's women. Today, Dr. Treadway is the director of the Library of Virginia, a position she has held since 2007. Based upon her work, there are few, if any better, more capable historians to talk about Virginia's remarkable women. I trust that after listening to this interview, you'll agree with me that Dr. Treadway is brilliant and worthy to be listed among Virginia's storied women.
This is a man's world. This is a man's world. Oh, but it wouldn't mean nothing without a woman or a girl.
Sandy, appreciate meeting with me today and talking about very notable women in Virginia's history. I'm really excited about this, especially the names that we chose here, some very impactful women. Go ahead and tell us briefly about the first one on the list that we discussed here.
Well, her name was Cockacoeske, and you can tell by the sound of the name that she was a native Virginian. She was actually the queen of the Pamunkey tribe from the time of the death of her husband in the 1650s through her death, which we think was sometime in 1686. We think today that that's very unusual for a woman to hold such a position of authority and power. But actually in Indian society, Native American society, it was not that unusual because inherited positions often descended through the mother's line rather than the father. So when her husband passed away, the authority over the Pamunkey tribe went to her. So she was quite an impressive figure for the period in which she was queen, and she held her own with the English at the time, which is partly why we know about her, because they wrote about her. We don't have anything in her own words, but we do have reflections, observations, and commentary from English observers.
What was that interaction with the English like? Was it tense? Was it a good working relationship? Or?
Well, her husband had actually cooperated with the English in some of the early colonial wars, and there were conflicts among Indian tribes in Virginia, and so the Pamunkeys did assist the English when they were fighting tribes that were the Pamunkey enemies as well. But it was convenient for the English to work with the Indians at times, and it wasn't at other times. And so one of her objectives was to impress on the English that they still needed the cooperation and partnership of Indians here in Virginia, that they still were a force and a presence to be reckoned with. And she approached negotiating with them, particularly in several points in the 1670s, and presumed herself to be an equal. Mm-hmm. And there's one wonderful description of her walking into a room with some members of the Governor's Council and the what's today the General Assembly. And she was very regal. She was very authoritative, and she did not cower. She did not When they'd raise an objection to something, she didn't give way. That impressed them very much. So she was definitely a representative for her people and trying to navigate a world in which everyone knew it was changing and the power was receding from the native tribes. But she wanted to hold on and protect the rights of her people for as long as possible.
Mm-hmm. What makes her important? There's a specific event, I guess, really helps out the Pamunkey tribe. You mentioned the 1670s there. It's not exactly a time of peace. It's more hostile, especially with Bacon's rebellion. Now, she steps into that power vacuum you mentioned with her husband passing away.
She did, and during Bacon's rebellion, actually helped the colonial leaders. But that didn't stop Bacon himself from raiding a number of Indian villages, taking prisoners,
including the Pamunkey,
yes.
Even though they weren't hostile.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And Bacon and his followers confiscated some goods and actually killed some Pamunkey Indians. And so Cockacoeske went to the English after that to register her grievance about that, to ask for restitution for her people, and ultimately to sign or to come to an understanding, sign an agreement whereby the English would recognize what they had done and create a situation of peace between the Pamunkeys and the English leaders. And that did happen with what's called the Treaty of Middle Plantation in 1677. And she gained from the English the formal recognition as being the ruler of and the person for them to deal with over the Pamunkey Indians. And in turn, she acknowledged her allegiance to the King of England.
So essentially they do become British subjects at that time, sort of?
I think that's what the English were thinking,
right.
And I think if that's what it took to accomplish what she wanted, she was fine if they thought that. But she never really acted like a subject.
certainly, yeah, right. But it definitely in the time there with she was related to Opechancanough and
yes,
such. Was that
she
her
was she was a descendant of his,
okay.
So not direct. And of course, he was the brother of the chief Powhatan, who was the paramount leader of Virginia Indians when Jamestown was first settled.
So definitely when you look at that, I mean, Powhatan, Opechancanough, and she comes in and she brings in peace and stability, whereas Powhatan and Opechancanough certainly didn't. And we still have fighting here by the 1670s. So that is impressive, especially when you look at names that the historical record definitely knows, Powhatan and Opechancanough in
right.
Virginia. She steps in and leaves something that's extremely lasting for her people. And we still have the Pamunkey tribe with us today, obviously, and that's... I would argue that it's in large part due to what she did.
Yeah, and it's always puzzled me when I learned her story why that somehow never made it into the history textbooks. In Virginia
right.
history, it seems to me that that's a story that's worth telling. So
well, certainly because a lot of the Indian tribes, when the English and other nations came in, pushed those Indian tribes out. There's very few native tribes that stayed within their regions. The Pamunkeys are definitely one of them. And we've got others in Virginia, the Mattaponi and so on, that are still here. And I think that's huge. I don't think that's a light thing to really look at. Because without somebody like Cockacoeske, they wouldn't be here anymore. They'd probably be in Oklahoma or just gone.
Right.
It's really phenomenal to look at.
And that's a heritage that I think the Pamunkey today are very, very proud of, and rightly so.
Rightly so.
You see, man made the car to take us over the road, and man made the train to carry the heavy load, and man made the electric light to take us out the dark.
Now, after her time period, the English certainly do move in. They certainly do spread out throughout the state. They do create a pretty complex society and a very independent society, one that definitely didn't look to England for everything, especially in government and such. And that
right.
eventually does bring conflict that we know of Revolutionary War. And typically we look at the Revolutionary War, we think of men like Patrick Henry, George Mason, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson. But there definitely were women in that time period that did fight and did have an influence and did have an impact on the state. We discussed talking about Anna Maria Lane. Can you tell me about her story?
She's always been one of my favorite historical figures since I first discovered some breadcrumbs in the records of the General Assembly about her, and I got curious and did a lot more research. She was, we're not exactly sure about her early life, but she was probably not born in Virginia. It was somewhere in New England, because we know that she was married to a man named John Lane, and he enlisted in the Continental Army from New Hampshire, so she's probably from up there. But what a lot of people don't realize is, when the average man left his farm or left his small business and went to fight for the American cause, many of the women who were left behind either had to find some way to carry on, or if they couldn't, they actually picked up and moved and followed the army, because that was the only support that they had. Mm-hmm. And if their husband was fighting, they would follow the army in the hopes of maybe getting rations or doing some work that would at least be a subsistence living for them. The history books call women like that camp followers, and sometimes it has a kind of pejorative term, but really what they did, and what Anna Maria Lane did, was pick up and follow her husband's unit, performing services such as cooking, nursing, being a seamstress, mending uniforms, and things like that. Things today that a modern army has units that take care of, but George Washington's army didn't.
Sure.
So it used to frustrate Washington to have all these women following the army. Sometimes it made maneuvers and logistics a little bit complicated, but he needed them, and he knew that he did. So Anna Maria Lane did that, and was at various points with her husband's unit. And we don't have details. They don't survive. But we do know that he was fighting with General Israel Putnam, the Battle of Germantown in Pennsylvania, and we have her later account, which was documented and proven to the satisfaction of officials who later gave her a pension. She was dressed as a soldier and on that battlefield in Germantown, and she sustained a wound that actually left her lame for the rest of her life. Where the Virginia connection comes in is that John Lane, and Anna Maria Lane was with him, was at Yorktown when the British surrendered. He's in Virginia, and obviously whatever he had left behind in his original home, there's nothing to go back to. And Virginia was setting up a public guard at an arsenal in Fluvanna County called Point of Fork, and he found a position there. And then after that, moved to Richmond, where the state was setting up a guard. In some ways, you could say it's our forerunner of the Capitol Police today, who protected the Capitol, protected the governor, and John Lane transferred and served in that public guard. So Anna Maria Lane came with him and continued her public service until she got too elderly to continue.
Now, she did do a number of things after the war. I mean, we look at what she did there in Germantown, which is really amazing for men, let alone women, and she's a small minority of women who did fight. That's phenomenal, but she definitely did more after the war that even makes her more important for the state. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? What was she involved in there?
Well, one of the important functions she did when she was here in Richmond was she served as a nurse, and took care of the needs of that public guard. And most of the public guard in those first few years really were Revolutionary War veterans who you could basically employ for fairly low wages, but they had the military background, but they were often ill or infirm, and that was one of the roles that she played there. So she was basically the support structure for that group of aging men who were protecting state government. And however, she got too old to really continue with that, as did her husband. And when they were finally discharged from public service, they and several others petitioned the General Assembly for a pension.
Okay.
And again, this is a new country, new service,
Right.
still feeling its way in that regard. But the General Assembly did try to look after its Revolutionary War veterans. What first caught my eye and got me really interested in her story was that the act that was passed giving a number of male veterans of the Revolution a 40-pound per year pension for life. The same act gave Anna Maria Lane 100 pounds per year. So for a woman to get, more than double, 2.5 times what a male veteran was getting, told me that her story of what she did at Jamestown must have been significant and impressive to the men who had to approve that pension. But they all had heard about it.
Mm-hmm.
And so in the act, they don't outline what that service was, what she actually did. So we
she was
don't
so famous
have
they didn't record it.
Exactly. It was an oral history. Everybody knew
Right.
what this woman had done, and so the actual details are lost to history. Unfortunately, I know it's heartbreaking. And I even looked at, letters and correspondence of some of the officers who were at that battle to see if anything turned up in there, and I hadn't found it. So.
That's the heartbreaking thing of Virginia history is there's gaps where we do lose some of the history. And, as a historian, it's fun to search and research for it and find it, but when you know it's not there, it's so painful. We were talking before the interview started about some of the James River plantations, and I'm finishing 1624 in my narrative, and from 1624 to 1676, there's very little. There's just so little there about how the state grew and how the families set up stuff. Now, we know how they did it, but the individual stories are gone. We lost a lot of that, and that's sadly the same situation here with Anna Maria Lane. Probably not that they lost it, it's just they didn't record it.
Right.
Is what you're saying.
Where you would find records of it would be if an individual interacted with government in some way, like through the courts or in leaving behind a will.
Right.
But a lot of the people of her level didn't have enough property to leave a will.
Right.
And in fact, but where we do see a record of her, in addition to the act that gave her the pension, she had to go quarterly to pick up her pension and sign that she received it. And her signature was the classic X that someone who could not read or write would sign. So we know she was illiterate. And the clerk would write under that this was Anna Maria Lane's signature. So it's a really poignant story, and I think a reminder when we think of the Revolution, we do think of the leaders, the men who led troops into battle and planned the strategy and won the war, but we don't often really think about the average common soldier and where they were coming from.
And then their wives and sisters and
Exactly.
daughters. Exactly. And I'm glad you point out that there were a lot of the women that followed along. I mean, what else were they to do? In many cases, their homes were already destroyed. They didn't have anything.
Exactly.
So for her, she decided to do something about it instead of just sit idly by. And that's certainly heroic and needs to be told.
What I do love is that actually a gentleman who was with the Sons of the American Revolution got interested in her story, and he led a move to erect a historical marker to her, which is just outside the gates of Capitol Square in downtown Richmond on 9th Street. And that's, I think, a wonderful thing because this is an area that tourists go to, and they may get curious about her.
I know exactly where the marker is too. I've seen it myself,
Yeah.
and I'll probably get a picture of it for this episode as well to put it on the show notes page.
And isn't it, I think, wonderful that it was the Sons of the American Revolution that erected that?
Which is, for those who may not understand, the Daughters of the American Revolution are the ones who go throughout the state and erect monuments, memorials all over the state. For the Sons to do it, that is pretty amazing and pretty telling.
Yeah.
And man made the boat for water, like Noah made the ark. This is a man's world, but it wouldn't mean nothing, no, without a woman or a girl.
Now, with Anna Maria Lane, you mentioned the illiterate, probably, I don't want to use the term lower class, but the next lady on our list definitely was somebody that was involved in high society in Virginia. she knew how to read, and she knew how to do a lot of things, and she did it very skillfully. We're talking about Elizabeth Van Lew, who was very instrumental during the Civil War as a spy, and she wasn't just a spy behind the lines. She was a spy right in the middle of the front lines, right in the middle of the action. Can you tell us a little bit about Elizabeth Van Lew?
She's a very interesting person, and someone who I think, again, probably was ignored for a while in history because her story goes against the prevailing narrative of Richmond's history during the Civil War period. But she was born in Richmond. Her parents had both been from the North, though, one from New York, one from Pennsylvania, and she was sent to Pennsylvania for education. So she did have a wider perspective and certainly, saw things from a different vantage point than just what would have been the case in Richmond. But her family was well-to-do, and they did own slaves. Her father died in the 1840s, so she was in her, I think, late 20s, and she and her mother lived in a beautiful mansion up on Church Hill, which is an old section of Richmond. And increasingly, she became uncomfortable with the institution of slavery and sympathized very much with the abolitionist cause and believed that slaves should be free. But she knew the context of the place in which she was living, and so she decided over time that she and her mother would find a way to liberate their slaves and that would be the best thing they could do. But then along came the American Civil War, and here she was now inside the capital of the Confederacy, feeling as she did, and feeling very much that the Confederate side, both because they were breaking away from the United States, which she believed was a good form of government, and because one of the prime reasons was to preserve the institution of slavery, she simply could not make her peace with that. And so she decided to do whatever she could. At first it was subtly, and then it became really covert, but very effective to help the Union cause.
Now, how did she do that? What was her method of being a spy?
Well, in the beginning, she got permission under kind of the woman's benevolence, do good for others, help your fellow man, to go into Libby Prison, which was the big prison where Union soldiers were kept in Richmond, and minister to the needs of those soldiers. So it was seen, it was not very popular with some of her neighbors and friends, but she convinced them she was doing it on the basis of humanitarian reasons. But of course she's talking with them, she's learning things from them, she's agreeing to pass messages on for them and being subversive in that way. But after about 2 years, the Confederate government clamped down on that, and they simply did not allow citizens to go in and visit Union soldiers. And so she decided, though, that what she had picked up through those networks was potentially very useful to particularly the Union Army.
Sure.
And she was not alone, she discovered, in Central Virginia. There were Quakers who believed slavery was wrong and therefore one should help the Union, and other Union sympathizers, that she put a network of these individuals together, and they worked on helping Union soldiers escape, on moving slaves through the Underground Railroad type network to freedom, and also to observing troop movements, picking up, ear to the ground, picking up what is going on inside the Confederacy and getting that word back to the Union Army. So she ran what after the war General Grant described as the most effective spy ring in the heart of the Confederacy, and several Union officers later after the war basically said the intelligence that she passed on was simply unparalleled and helped them to win the war. How did she get away with it is the thing you have to ask, right?
Right, and she got away with it during the war, but after the war she suffered for it a little bit, didn't she?
Yes. I mean, during the war, there were some folks that were suspicious, and there was actually an investigation. But here she is, she's a very slightly built, quiet person, they couldn't conceive that a woman could do something
Right.
like that. So
That helps her. That's on her side. I mean, if
Yes.
she were a man, that would have been a different story. They would have probably looked at it saying, "What are you doing?" You know.
exactly, they would have instantly have been. They were suspicious, but they couldn't conceive that a woman could do anything
Sure.
significantly subversive. But after the war, people felt comfortable talking about what she had done,
Right.
and she starts to get praise from former, Union soldiers that she'd helped and so forth. And so the city of Richmond starts learning what she had done. Because of her loyalty and service, and because she had risked a lot of her own and lost a lot of her own personal fortune in the work that she did, because she had to bribe some people to get information and to make some things happen. General Grant was so grateful. He named her, well, I'll say postmistress of Richmond, but she refused
Certainly.
to accept that. She wanted to be called the postmaster of Richmond, which was a plum, politically patronage position. It paid very well. But you can imagine how her neighbors and friends in Richmond felt that here was somebody they felt had betrayed them or stabbed them in the back and now was being rewarded. So there was a tremendous amount of hostility toward her after the war. She also believed that the South and Virginia had to change, and change in significant ways. So she supported the amendments to the Constitution that made, black citizens and gave them voting rights and so forth.
Right.
And she also supported the very radical notion of woman suffrage. And so that only alienated her more
Right.
from the society in which she lived.
Somewhat ahead of her time in that respect, with the slavery issue during the Civil War, but then afterward you throw suffrage on top of it. That society, mid-19th century Virginia, their heads would explode essentially. They don't know how to accept that.
Exactly.
Which is exactly what happened with her. I mean, she was alienated, as you mentioned. She's got this elevated position, but society wasn't going to accept her in that position. Did she keep that position?
She kept it throughout the Grant administration, and then after that, lost it. And she managed to get by, but certainly her family did not any longer have means. And when she died, very simple funeral, and not a large attendance due to the way she was regarded here in town. But also toward the end of her life, the only way that people could explain what she had done was basically to say, she really wasn't in her right mind. And they created this myth and a nickname, Crazy Bet, to explain why she had done what she did. But all historians who have really delved into her story, they don't find any evidence of that at all. Just she was so out of sync with the society in which she was living.
Kind of like a 19th century smear campaign, I guess, to make her look worse.
But, she could have chosen. She had family in the North, and she could have chosen to have left and to lived elsewhere, and she didn't, because she thought of Virginia and Richmond as her home, and she wanted to reform it and make it better. But, the forces against the changes that she supported were so strong that it didn't happen. It was really a lost opportunity for Virginia.
Well, that certainly is praiseworthy in the fact that she was steadfast in the midst of all that opposition, and there was quite a bit of opposition. That's definitely admirable.
Man thinks a bit about the baby girls and the baby boys.
Now, she wasn't the only one trying to make things change after the Civil War. The next lady on our list, Caroline Putnam, also was very much so involved in a very, again, on the front lines kind of a manner. Can you tell us about Caroline?
Yes, she was a woman from New England who did what very few women of her time had the opportunity to do, and the family support to do, which was she attended college. And at the time, a young woman who did want to, 9 times out of 10, ended up at Oberlin, which was a school that was devoted to equal education for the sexes. There she met a woman named Sally Holly, who became a lifelong friend of hers. And under Holly's influence, she came to become a supporter of abolition as well. And so after she graduated from college, She actually went on the speaking circuit with Sally Holly and others, trying to convince Americans in the North to support the end of slavery. Sally Holly was apparently quite a talker and an overt personality. Caroline Putnam was a little quieter. It was really hard for her to get up in front of an audience and do this, but she believed very much in that cause. And she met some of the, great male orators and supporters of abolition in her travels. But when the Civil War was over and the slaves were freed now, they were freed people in the South, she realized, as many Northerners did, that the road ahead for those newly freed men and women was going to be very difficult. And she wanted to do something tangible to help them. And so she joined the ranks of others that were sponsored by the Freedmen's Bureau or other groups in the North who came into the South to teach the freedmen, teach African Americans how to function in the society, how to get ahead, how to get the skills that would help to make them successful, because she realized education was the key to everything. And through her friend Sally Holly, she was able, together they purchased a piece of land in Northumberland County in the little town of Lottsburg and set up a school. As you can imagine, the same kind of hostility that Elizabeth Van Lew faced, she faced there as well. The white populace, mostly a farming community, very small local businesses, couldn't get their heads around the fact that their former slaves were now their equals and now entitled to rights and privileges of citizenship.
Well, sure, not too long before this, it was illegal to educate.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So the African American community in and around Lottsburg, some of them had picked up some rudimentary education, could read a few things, but basically were starting from ground zero. And so she started this school, and the way she paid for it primarily was through the philanthropy of various Northern organizations and individuals. One of the people who contributed to her school was Louisa May Alcott. And then there were Quaker groups and others. And how we know about what happened at the school is because she wrote letters back to people who had contributed to tell them, here's what I'm doing with your money. Here's what's happening here. They had to charge something, but they basically charged on a family's ability to pay. Right. So if a family had 4 children and simply couldn't pay tuition, then she would ask the mother and father of the family to help keep the grounds of the school, or maybe help with cooking meals for the students, or making clothes, or doing something that would give back to keep the school alive. So a combination of philanthropy and the sort of in-kind support of the families whose children were going there. But she also did run some classes for adults as well, because they were just as much in need of education as young people. And one account I read of the school, really interesting, because they did celebrate all the traditional holidays that we think of as American holidays. But she included among those things like Emancipation Day, the day that Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, and then the day on which the slaves were freed with the fall of the Confederacy. And she commemorated birthdays of some of the leading abolitionists, along with, and of course, Abraham Lincoln, whose birthday was not celebrated in Virginia at the time. And she tried to develop the whole person. She wanted to educate their minds, but also help them have skills that would stand them in good stead in their future years. Most Freedmen's Bureau teachers came down, stayed 5 or 6, maybe 10 years, and then eventually went back home. She stayed here for the rest of her life.
So she developed those relationships and that longer-lasting impact. Now, what happened to her school?
When she died she retired a few years before she died. She died in 1917, but the school continued. Mm-hmm. And then after her death, it was placed in the hands of a local group of black individuals who were local farmers and businessmen to operate, which they did for a number of years. But then over time, it lost the ability to fund it diminished, and then it lost its clientele because at a certain point, the county recognized it was supposed to provide some education, and so built a segregated school for black children. But the original building is no longer there, but the building that replaced it is still standing in Northumberland. There's a historic marker there, and they still very much tell her story. One of the creative things she did to try to win over the local populace was she convinced the federal government to place the location of the post office. She wasn't the postmistress, but the post office was located on her property. Okay. So everybody had to come to pick up their mail, whether they were black or white. So because she hoped that if white citizens went, they would see the good she was doing.
Sure.
And that may have helped somewhat. There was never any violence against her or any threats or any efforts to oust her. She was just ostracized and very lonely living where she did.
Somewhat of a comparison. We know of Booker T. Washington and the stuff that he did throughout the state, being Virginian as well. But it's great. I mean, there were other women like Caroline Putnam that were doing much the same situation, helping now freed blacks to integrate into society. And knowing a little bit about Revolutionary era period, that was a big concern. They didn't know what to do. A lot of the leaders wanted to free their slaves, but they just didn't know how. And it's somebody just taking the initiative, like Caroline Putnam, and saying, "Here's how." Many years later,
give them the life skills that they will need in order to advance and succeed in society. Yeah.
Certainly, and her legacy can absolutely be seen in the next lady on our list as well, because she did go to Hampton, now University, but Institute at the time. She was brilliant.
This is a man's, this is a man's love, this is a man's world, but it wouldn't be nothing without a woman or a girl.
And what can you tell us about Mary Jackson?
Well, Mary Jackson is, again, another one of those stories that when you learn it, you say, how is it possible we didn't know about her before? She's probably a little better known now because of the wonderful book that Margot Shetterly wrote called Hidden Figures that then became a major motion picture. Sure. So Mary Jackson is one of those hidden figures, born in 1921 in Hampton, a very segregated society, went to the black high school there and graduated, and then went to, as you said, to Hampton University, where she studied mathematics and I think it was physics, and apparently excelled, was really excellent at her work. And she did a number of jobs after graduation, but never quite found something that really challenged her, because she was very, very intelligent until she was able to, after World War II, to find a position at Langley Aeronautical, Space Center outside Hampton, and was working in the computing pool there, and her ability was spotted by I believe it was a Polish scientist who was running the wind tunnel experiments there at Langley, and he brought her onto his team, and she simply blew them all away. She excelled with her capability and her knowledge and her innate understanding of mathematics, and he actually encouraged her to try to get credentials to become an engineer. And there's that wonderful scene in the film, which is spot on true, where to do that she had to take certain courses which were only offered at a white high school, and so she had to get approval to walk into a classroom with white students, sit down and take the class with them, because Virginia's segregation laws were so strict. But she did get that approval, and she did become an engineer at Langley, where she worked for many, many years. I didn't know this because the book didn't go into the end of her story, but at a certain point, what she realized was both being black and being female there was very much a glass ceiling in our space program and in every other major federal program. And so she actually resigned her engineering position and went to work for the women's, can't remember the exact name of it, women's program.
She was trying to help advance their careers.
Trying to help advise other women as to how to work the system and get ahead when it was sort of stacked against them. So pretty impressive lady who passed away quietly in 2005.
She made the news where in our area. I live in Norfolk, and we have the same news in Norfolk and Hampton, and she made the news.
She did make that. Oh, good.
Yeah, my father, I was talking to him about her, and he's like, I know that name. Oh yeah, I remember. And we go by Langley and NASA all the time. Passed it on the way up here to interview you today. We were talking about her as well on the way up. She did a lot there at NASA, but I'm glad you brought up the other aspect. Certainly, a lot of praise should be heaped on her for what she did there in NASA. But she did other stuff. She was involved in her community in such a way that she definitely cared about other people, which I find fascinating just as a whole for anyone. But she cared a lot about Girl Scouts.
Yes.
Margot Shetterly mentions that in her book. She also she briefly mentioned taking the pay cut to help out other women. She said she ran out of space for the book, I believe. I wish I would have known more about that aspect of her career later on, because she did all of this major work at NASA and then takes that step back, and for the last, I forget what it is, 15 or 20 years, she's helping other women work through what she had already gone through.
That is very much embedded in African American women's culture, particularly in the late 19th and early 20th century. The African American Women's Club had a slogan, "Lifting as we climb." And I think women like Mary Jackson took that seriously. In other words, if I succeed, it is my responsibility to turn around and help others do the same.
Did.
And she really lived that.
And you can see it even in her time period, because she wasn't the only black female computer during that time. She was helping others as she was moving on. And I never got a sense of any anger, bitterness, or complaint. Anybody in any situation can find something to complain about, but she just overcame it. She said, here's the task in front of me. Yeah, I've got to go and sit in a high school classroom with students that I know I'm smarter than, but she never complained or never showed any kind of arrogance. And I fell in love with her when I started to research her. I said, this is great. And Margot Shetterly's book, I loved, because she's explaining and detailing society in a geographic location that I'm very familiar with. Mm-hmm. And I can just see women like Mary Jackson walking around doing her work. I would have loved knowing her. It's too bad she passed away when I was living in Illinois, but I would have liked to have met her.
But I think her story is a reminder to us that there are so many other individuals like that.
Absolutely.
That someone out there knows about, but thought of them just as a neighbor, as a friend, as a community leader, and didn't realize, just how exceptional they were, and how having their story as part of our larger understanding of Virginia history in this case really makes a difference.
Certainly. And you can see the connection. I mean, we've walked through Cockacoeske now down to Mary Jackson, and there's kind of a thread that brings them all together and how they've impacted, showing their diversity, but showing their steadfastness, and from 1670s down to 2005, definitely had an impact. Definitely stories we need to look at and ponder and learn from. How can we learn more about these and other notable women in Virginia and throughout the United States as well?
Well, one of the things that is a wonderful resource that's the Library of Virginia, where I work, is contributes to, but so does the Virginia Humanities in Charlottesville, is an online resource called Encyclopedia Virginia. Right. Many of these women are there, not all yet, because it's a growing resource. But if someone you're interested in is there, and if you don't know who, you can search just on women, and you'll get or whatever subject or time period you'd like, and get basic information. And there's always a list of sources at the end. So books, articles, places you can, websites where you can go to do more.
Are there any that you in particular recommend? I mean, we mentioned Hidden Figures, for instance. That's a book definitely we'd recommend. Are there any others you think Karen Abbott did that. Liar, Temptress, Soldier, Spy was the name of it, I believe.
Right,
Talking
right.
about 4 specific spies, and Van Leeuw was in there.
But on Van Leeuw, the absolute best book is a book by a woman named Elizabeth Varon, who wrote a biography of her maybe 8 or 9 years ago. She's at, I want to say, I can't remember the exact name, something like Confederate Woman, Yankee Spy, something like that. But it's a fantastic biography of her. You know, and somebody like Cockacoeske or Anna Marie Lane, you're not going to find full-blown treatments because the documentary record just isn't there. But there are some, wonderful books that talk about women in the context of their time. A recent one just came out about a slave owned by Martha Washington named Ona Judd, and how she escaped and how Martha Washington spent almost the rest of her life trying to get her back. A wonderful tale of both sides of that story. So there are individual biographies. There are also collective biographies. Sure. I worked on a edited series of essays on, I think there are 36 women in 2 volumes called Virginia Women, Their Lives and Times. That's a wonderful resource. Caroline Putnam's in there, for example.
I absolutely recommend it. And I know one of your own essays is in there as well.
And probably the Library of Virginia did publish a book called Changing History, Virginia Women Through 4 Centuries. And that's a great introduction as well to the whole sweep of women's history since the founding of Jamestown up through the present. So there are great resources such as that out there. We also do every year during Women's History Month a Virginia Women in History program.
Absolutely.
So where we identify 8 women, some deceased, some living, from the past, who we tell their stories. We produce a poster that goes out to all the schools. We do lesson plans for teachers so that they can build women's history activities around them. And those are great resources as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, I look forward to that every year. It's an interesting, I'm always curious who's going to be on the list, and I love looking back and seeing that. Now, when you came to Library of Virginia, you brought that with you, right? Because Library of Virginia wasn't doing that before 2000, I believe?
Well, actually, that project was something started years ago by the Virginia Foundation for Women, which actually went out of business. And when they were disbanding, they came to us, the library, and said, it's such a great program. Teachers love it.
Sure.
There's no running out of subjects. And they knew that we had a lot of the expertise and the records here.
Certainly.
And they said, would you pick it up? And so we did. And we've been doing it ever since.
Like you said, there's a lot of resources. We boiled it down to 5 women, but there's many more.
For any one of those, we could talk about hundreds. Yes,
Sure, certainly. Well, Sandy, I really appreciate it. This was great, and for all the listeners, definitely look into all the materials that we discussed. I'll put those on the show notes page. Again, I appreciate it.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thanks so much.
This is a man's world. But it wouldn't mean nothing, oh, without a woman. Oh,
Thank you for tuning into this special episode of the Virginia History Podcast in conjunction with Commemoration 2019. Visit Commemoration 2019 at AmericanEvolution2019.com to see the programs and events being coordinated throughout Virginia. Links can also be found on our website, vahistorypodcast.com. Don't forget to check out the show notes page for this episode, in which one can find the books discussed in this interview, as well as links to the Library of Virginia and their work highlighting Virginia's women. Please also visit the podcast's Facebook page, which can be found at facebook.com/VAHISPod. Like us to keep up with the new episodes and announcements that are forthcoming. Finally, consider supporting the work being done by contributing on Patreon. Visit the campaign at patreon.com/VAHISPod to see the choices and rewards being offered. And tune in next time for our continued walk through Virginia's history as we see the transition into Virginia's becoming a royal colony.
Oh, Baba, do, 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 Pato do pato despedido do Zé,